Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we're diving into something shiny, bloody, and utterly ridiculous, the medieval tournament. Forget your fairy tales of valiant knights in shining armor, fair maidens, and noble deeds. That wasn't a historical event. That was Renaissance propaganda and 19th century cosplay. A medieval tournament wasn't a sporting event as you know it. It was more like a sanctioned riot designed to inflict maximum damage while looking vaguely impressive. Think less Super Bowl, more Thunderdome with poorly maintained weaponry and rampant internal bleeding. This isn't a cozy history lesson about chivalry. It's a survival gauntlet, a guided tour through what happened when rich guys decided hitting each other very hard was a fun way to spend a Tuesday. So before we plunge headfirst into the mud, blood, and splintered lances, hit like and subscribe, but only if you're ready for history's ugly, inconvenient truth. Seriously, click it. It feeds the algorithm, which is less brutal than a medieval knight, but arguably more insidious. Now dim the lights, brace yourself, and step into history's darkest corners, where the trees are watching and they're definitely not on your side. Picture the scene, the stench of horse sweat, excited crowds, and the metallic tang of anticipation. And impending trauma. What would you do if your best career path involved getting smacked by a horse-powered telephone pole? Let me know in the comments below. So, you picture a tournament, pennants flapping, trumpets blaring, knights riding gracefully. Cute. The reality was often a chaotic, muddy field barely cordoned off, where dozens or even hundreds of armed men would simply wail on each other. Early tournaments, particularly the melee, were essentially staged warfare, often covering miles of countryside. It wasn't about winning points for style. It was about capturing opponents for ransom, stealing their horses and armor, and generally causing expensive property damage, both to gear and to people. Think about your worst bar fight. Now add horses, swords, axes, and the total lack of dental insurance. This wasn't regulated sport, it was controlled chaos with a prize table. You could lose your life, your livelihood, or just a significant portion of your face for the chance to win, maybe a hawk. The goal was often blunt force trauma. Swords were sometimes blunted, yes, but they were still massive chunks of metal swung with lethal force. Lances were designed to shatter, but the impact transferred through the armor was enough to liquefy internal organs. They called this sport. The corpses called it a Tuesday. One common tactic in the melee was simply overwhelming a single knight. You'd have 3 or 4 guys pile on, wrestle him off his horse, and then encourage him to surrender for ransom. If he refused, well, steel is less forgiving than your mortgage lender. Your odds of walking away unscathed were statistically similar to winning the lottery while being struck by lightning. This wasn't just knights being idiots, mind you. It was a high-stakes, brutal business. A good horse and set of armor cost a fortune, maybe the equivalent of several years' income for a wealthy lord. Losing them meant financial ruin, not just bruised pride. So they fought like cornered animals because in many ways they were. They were trained killers doing what they did best, but under a banner of honor. And you sitting here thinking it was all so noble, bless your naive little heart. All right, maybe the melee was too messy for your delicate sensibilities. You prefer the joust, right? 2 knights head-to-head, a test of skill and courage, a graceful clash. Absolutely not. The joust was a deliberate attempt to concentrate maximum kinetic energy onto a very small point, your opponent, specifically their chest or head. The goal wasn't to gently unseat them. It was to hit them with the force of a small car crash and see what happened. You'd be riding a 1,000-pound animal at full gallop, carrying a 15-foot-long, solid wooden lance. Your target was another guy doing the exact same thing, heading right for you. The physics alone were horrifying. When those lances connected, the force was immense. Armor helped, sure, but it didn't absorb the shock. It merely distributed it. often across your rib cage, collarbone, or spine. Consider the equipment. Those fancy helmets, they restricted vision severely. You were essentially aiming blind, trusting your horse and hoping you didn't accidentally skewer the guy selling meat pies on the sideline. The armor was heavy, hot, and incredibly restrictive. If you got knocked off your horse, just standing up could be a Herculean task, especially with a few broken ribs rattling around inside your chest cavity. Prince Henry the Young King, son of Henry II of England, died in 1183 not from battle, but from dysentery contracted after participating in a series of brutal melees. He literally ran himself to death for glory and cash. Another fun historical tidbit: William Marshall, one of the most famous knights, made a fortune in tournaments through sheer skill and ruthlessness, allegedly capturing over 500 knights for ransom. This wasn't sport, it was a business model built on pain and financial coercion. Your student loan debt, try owing your freedom and every penny you own to the guy who just knocked you unconscious. The sound of a lance hitting armor was like a thunderclap right next to your ear, followed by the horrifying crack of splintering wood, or worse, groaning metal and bone. You could smell the fear, the sweat, the leather, and often the distinct coppery tang of blood in the air. The touch, the rough, unforgiving wood of the lance, the suffocating weight of the armor, the cold, hard ground rushing up to meet you. They called this chivalry. Your fractured skull called it game over. You think you could handle it. You who complains when the Wi-Fi is slow, you wouldn't last 5 seconds before wetting yourself or breaking something vital. This was a world where entertainment involved watching people get violently incapacitated for bragging rights and prizes that might amount to a few cows or a slightly used suit of armor. As if you weren't instantly killed, a surprisingly frequent outcome, the injuries sustained in a tournament were often gruesome and life-altering. We're not talking about a sprained ankle here. Think massive concussions, broken limbs protruding through skin, internal hemorrhaging, and horrific facial trauma. Getting hit by a lance was like being struck by a medieval pointed freight train. Armor might stop the lance, but the force transferred through it could snap your neck like a twig. Blunt force trauma was the specialty of the house. Even with blunted swords and maces, the sheer force applied was enough to shatter bones and cause catastrophic internal injuries. A solid whack to the helmet could leave you with brain damage, assuming it didn't just collapse your skull entirely. And medical care, let's just say it involved a lot of praying, leeches, and amputation without anesthesia. If you survived the initial injury, you still had to contend with infection, gangrene, and medieval doctors whose idea of sterile was, rinsed it under the pump yesterday. Consider the grisly details often omitted from romantic tales. Broken noses were a given, lost teeth, absolutely. Eyes, if the visor wasn't secure, a splintered lance could easily take one out. Limbs were twisted, crushed, and pulverized. Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, a prominent figure in the 12th century, died from a jousting injury in 1144. King Henry II of France died in 1559 after Gabriel Montgomery's lance splintered and a piece went through his eye into his brain. They literally just kept right on jousting even after seeing what a wooden stick could do to a king's face. The stench of the casualty tent would have been unbearable. Sweat, blood, vomit, and the sweet, foul smell of untreated wounds. You'd hear the screams of men being treated, which often meant sawing off a limb with a rusty saw. This wasn't heroic sacrifice. It was industrial-scale trauma for rich people's entertainment and potential profit. They risked everything for honor, but mostly they risked it for prize money, ransom, and the chance to climb the greasy, bloody social ladder. Your chances of ending up maimed were significantly higher than your chances of ending up famous. This was the reality behind the pageantry. They called it glory. You'd call it a lawsuit waiting to happen if there were any lawyers left alive. You forget the romanticized notion of knights fighting for a lady's favor or some abstract concept of honor. While those elements existed in the ballads, the concrete reality of a tournament was often about cold, hard cash. Or more accurately, cold, hard ransom. Capturing an opponent in the melee or even just unhorsing them effectively in the joust often meant you had just acquired a valuable asset. A knight whose freedom and property were now yours to negotiate. This wasn't just petty theft, it was big business. A knight, especially a wealthy or well-known one, could be worth a fortune in ransom. His armor, his horse, his weapons, all valuable prizes that went to the victor. The constitutions of the tournament formalized this, detailing how captives were to be held and ransomed. It was less about proving you were the best fighter and more about proving you were the most effective kidnapper in fancy dress. Imagine the scenario. You've just been unhorsed, maybe you've got a broken arm and your vision is swimming. Some guy in dented armor is standing over you, his gauntleted hand outstretched not to help you up, but to demand your surrender. Your freedom, your lands, your family's future could all depend on this negotiation. Refuse and things got unpleasant. You might find yourself persuaded with a dagger point or a few well-aimed kicks to the ribs. The sound of coins exchanging hands or the rustle of parchment detailing property transfers was as much a part of the tournament soundscape as the clash of steel. The smell wasn't just sweat and blood, it was also the tension of financial ruin hanging in the air. The touch was the rough grip of your captor, the weight of the debt settling on your shoulders. It really puts your credit card balance into perspective, doesn't it? Your rent anxiety. Try owning nothing, including your own person, until your family drains their coffers. One of the most infamous examples involves the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where so many French knights were captured that their ransoms crippled the French economy for years. Tournaments were training grounds for this kind of high-value capture. They were essentially practicing for war, where the spoils went to the victor, only this was peacetime. You weren't just risking death for glory. You were risking financial servitude or worse, and people paid to watch this. Seriously, you with your stable job and health insurance think this sounds barbaric? Of course you do. You've never had to choose between your ancestral lands and your front teeth. And you think modern sports have safety regulations, padding, referees, concussion protocols. The medieval tournament safety manual could be written on a single blood-stained napkin. Early on, it was pretty much, don't intentionally kill your opponent outside the agreed-upon area, and even that was more of a guideline than a rule. As tournaments evolved, especially the joust, some rules were introduced, but they were about as effective as a chainmail condom. They might decree that you couldn't strike a fallen opponent or that lances had to be a la plaisance, but enforceability was patchy at best. When adrenaline is high, stakes are lethal, and everyone is swinging sharpened hunks of metal, rules become suggestions whispered into the wind. Accidents or conveniently framed accidents were rampant. If you fell, you were a sitting duck, heavy, immobile, and surrounded by people who just saw you as a potential prize or obstacle. Getting trampled by horses or accidentally stabbed by someone helping you up wasn't uncommon. Consider the sheer lack of proper barriers. Spectators often crowded terrifyingly close to the action. A broken lance, a runaway horse, a knight losing control, any of these could send lethal force flying into the stands. Chroniclers occasionally mention spectators being injured or killed, a grim reminder that the danger wasn't confined to the fighters. Your modern safety railing, they had excited peasants and a piece of rope. Your chances of being impaled by a flying piece of wood were non-zero. The smell in the spectator area wouldn't have been much better than the field. A heady mix of unwashed bodies, sweat, fear, cheap ale, and the lingering odor of horse manure. You'd hear the roar of the crowd, the thud of hooves, the sickening crunch of impact, and the collective gasp or cheer depending on whose favorite night just got rearranged. The touch, the jostling of the crowd, the rough wood of a makeshift barrier, the mud splashing up from the field. They called it a spectacle. You'd call it a public health hazard disguised as entertainment. Your workplace safety briefing. Imagine that delivered by someone holding an axe and covered in mud. You, safely ensconced in your climate-controlled viewing space, can barely comprehend a world where getting your skull fractured for prize money was a viable career choice. But that was the medieval tournament, a place where honor was paid for in pain and safety was an afterthought for everyone involved, including the poor sods watching from the sidelines. You think this is bad? You haven't even heard about what they did to the losers. You didn't just lose the match, you lost everything. If you weren't killed or crippled and you survived the ransom negotiation, there was the crushing weight of shame and ruined reputation. In a society built on martial prowess and honor, being soundly defeated in a public spectacle wasn't just embarrassing. It could genuinely tank your social standing and future prospects. Imagine being paraded off the field, maybe with a broken leg or a face covered in blood, your expensive armor dented and useless. The crowds who cheered moments before were now laughing, jeering, or simply looking away in disappointment. This wasn't just a bad game, it was a public humiliation that could follow you for years. They called it a display of valor. Your shattered ego called it rock bottom. Your ability to secure lands, find a good marriage, or advance in military service depended heavily on your perceived skill and success as a fighter. A string of losses or a particularly ignominious defeat could mark you as incompetent, cowardly, or simply unlucky, all terrible labels for a medieval knight. You weren't just losing a tournament. You were potentially losing your entire future. Think about the psychological toll. You trained for years, spent a fortune on gear, risked your life, only to be knocked into the mud by some guy from the next county. The taste of defeat would be bitter metallic, like licking a rusty sword. The smell, not victory and roses, but sweat, tears, and the acrid stench of failure clinging to your expensive but useless armor. The touch. The cold, hard ground against your cheek, the pain throbbing through your body, the heavy weight of your dented helmet a constant reminder of your failure. They called it a path to glory. For many, it was a shortcut to the poorhouse or an early grave. For some, the injuries were so severe that they couldn't fight again. A knight whose body was permanently damaged lost his primary skill and source of income. He couldn't participate in tournaments, couldn't serve in war effectively. He became a burden, his value diminished to his family and lord. This wasn't like retiring from football with a few knee problems. This was potentially losing your entire identity and means of survival. They called it proving yourself. For a surprising number, it meant proving they were no longer capable of anything at all. A significant percentage of knights' careers were ended not by old age, but by tournament injuries. Your severance package, try a lifetime of chronic pain and dependency. You thought the physical danger was the worst part, you were wrong. The real horror was realizing that even if you survived, the game could still break you, leaving you with nothing but scars and the memory of your public failure. Feeling smug because you sit safely on your couch. Don't worry, history has ways of reminding you that vulnerability is just a poorly aimed lance away. You weren't the only one who thought this whole tournament thing was a bit much. The church absolutely detested tournaments. They saw them as pointless, violent, and a dangerous distraction from the knight's supposed holy duty to God and king. Plus, dying in a tournament meant you probably didn't get last rites, which was a major problem for your eternal soul, assuming you believed in that sort of thing. Several popes issued bans. The Second Lateran Council in 1139 prohibited tournaments, denying Christian burial to those who died in them. Later, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 doubled down on this, explicitly forbidding clergy from attending the damn things. They literally said, "Stop hitting each other for fun, it's bad for your eternal health." Did the church care about your immortal soul? Sure, but also about you dying inconveniently without leaving money in your will. They tried to save your soul by condemning the very activity you thought proved your worth. Knights, however, mostly ignored the church. Getting excommunicated for hitting someone with a lance was a small price to pay for potentially winning a prize horse or capturing a rival for ransom. The smell inside a cathedral, all incense and piety, was a world away from the muddy, blood-soaked fields where true honor was won. The touch of rough wool vestments felt very different from the cold, hard steel of your gauntlets. Your bishop complaining you wasted God's time? Try getting excommunicated for wasting God's time by getting speared. Kings also banned tournaments occasionally, but usually for more practical reasons. Henry II of England banned them because he worried they drained knights and resources he needed for actual wars, and also provided convenient cover for political plotting. Edward I later encouraged them, but tried to keep them controlled within specific, less politically dangerous locations. The shifting rules and bans just highlight how genuinely disruptive and potentially dangerous these events were, not just to the participants, but to the stability of the realm. These prohibitions were about as effective as telling teenagers not to gather in large groups. Knights would just go to the next county or even across the channel to get their fix of state-sanctioned brawling. The lines between tournament, political demonstration, and outright war became incredibly blurred. Alliances were formed and broken, feuds were settled with steel instead of words, and knights honed the skills they would use to kill people in actual battles, but first, they'd practice on each other for cash prizes. This wasn't just practice. It was actively deciding who owed who based on who got knocked off their horse the hardest. Did the church care about your mortal well-being? Not as much as they cared about you showing up for mass and not dying before confession. You think regulations solve everything? Medieval knights invented loopholes before lawyers did. They found ways to keep bashing each other because, frankly, they were good at it, and it paid better than tilling fields. You think you work out, you hit the gym for an hour, maybe complain about sore muscles. These guys started training for violence as children. Pages, then squires, learning horsemanship, weapon skills, and how to move effectively in heavy armor. It wasn't about looking good. It was about building a body that could withstand ridiculous levels of punishment and dish it back out. Think less spin class, more get hit with a stick until you learn to block. They'd practice with heavy blunted swords, swing axes that could cleave a man in two, and learn to couch a lance while riding at full speed. They wrestled in full armor, learned to fall without breaking their necks, and trained their horses to handle the chaos of combat. This wasn't just practice. It was conditioning your mind and body for the constant threat of death or dismemberment. Your personal trainer charging you too much. These guys paid with blood, sweat, and occasionally broken bones during practice. And the cost, a knight's equipment was ruinously expensive. Custom-made armor, multiple war horses, squires, and servants to maintain it all. This wasn't a hobby. It was a massive financial investment requiring constant upkeep. All that money, all that grueling effort, all that training for what? For the chance to get kicked in the head by a horse you just bought, or get impaled by a guy who trained just as hard as you did. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of grievous bodily harm paid for up front. The smell of the training yard would be intense. Sweat, dust, horse manure, and the metallic tang of steel hitting steel. You'd hear the clang of weapons, the grunts of effort, the sharp cries of pain when something went wrong. The touch, The rough leather of the reins, the cold, heavy steel of the sword hilt, the chafing of the armor against your skin. You were literally hardening your body for the express purpose of enduring and inflicting violence. This wasn't about self-improvement. It was about becoming a more efficient instrument of pain, your own included. Did all that training make you invincible? It just made you a more valuable target. You spent years of your life and a small fortune preparing for an event where the most likely outcomes were painful injury, financial ruin, or death. All that dedication, all that sacrifice, just for the chance to maybe win a prize horse or capture a rival for ransom. It really makes you question your career path, doesn't it? You think your job is demanding. Try getting paid in potential head trauma. And you thought that shiny metal suit made you invincible. Think again. Medieval armor, while impressive for its time, was far from perfect. Early male armor was great against cuts, but useless against the massive concussive force of a lance or mace blow. Later plate armor offered better protection, especially tournament-specific versions that were thicker and heavier, but it traded mobility and visibility for slightly better chances of survival. Even the best armor had weak points, joints, visors, the gaps where pieces overlapped. A well-aimed strike could find these vulnerabilities with devastating results. And even if the armor stopped the weapon, it didn't stop the energy transfer. Think of getting hit by a baseball bat while wearing a sturdy jacket. It hurts like hell even if the jacket isn't pierced. Your bulletproof vest anxiety. These guys worried about getting their ribs turned into jelly inside their chest piece. The weapons themselves were purpose-built for maximum impact. Lances for jousting evolved, sometimes featuring coronals blunt, crown-shaped tips designed to spread the impact but still deliver a bone-crushing blow. But often they were just sharpened or pointed, designed to unseat by force or, penetrate. The sound of a lance shattering was explosive, a sharp crack followed by splintering wood flying everywhere. The smell was of wood dust, sweat, and hot, stressed metal. Remember King Henry II of France? Died in 1559 after a jousting accident. Sir Gabriel Montgomery's lance didn't just hit his helmet, it splintered. A piece went through the king's eye hole and into his brain. This wasn't an issue with the armor failing. It was an issue with the weapon itself becoming shrapnel designed to cause damage. Your fear of paper cuts. Imagine that, but the paper is wood and traveling at 30 mph towards your eye. Even safe tournament armor, the super heavy stuff specifically made for jousting, was a trap. If you fell, you were a turtle on its back, completely helpless. Getting up in 100+ pounds of metal was a struggle even on flat ground. In the mud, dazed and injured, it was often impossible. The touch was the cold, unyielding metal against your skin, the rough edges of buckles and straps, the pain where dented steel pressed against bruised flesh. They wore more armor to prove their bravery, and it often made them more vulnerable once they fell. So that shining suit of armor, it wasn't just protection. It was part of the engine of destruction, a mobile cage designed to withstand impact while the guy inside hopefully didn't turn into soup. And sometimes, as Henry II found out, the gear itself was the deadliest part of the equation. Feeling like your life is tough, at least your work uniform doesn't come with a built-in risk of cranial penetration from flying debris. And you think your entertainment is messed up. You watch reality TV or scrolling through disaster videos online. Bless your sheltered little life. Medieval people flocked to tournaments by the thousands, if not tens of thousands. They came from all walks of life: nobles, merchants, peasants, clergy. This wasn't just an event for the elite. It was a massive public spectacle, a medieval circus where the clowns got permanently disfigured. They came for the excitement, sure, the pageantry, the chance to see famous knights in action. But let's be honest, they mostly came for the violence. It was a chance to see lords and knights, the guys who usually oppressed them, risking life and limb, potentially getting smeared across a field. It was the original blood sport, live and in person, with no pay-per-view required. A major tournament could attract crowds larger than many medieval cities' permanent populations. Your stadium ticket prices. Try bribing a guard for a good view near the death zone. Tournaments were also massive social and economic events. Merchants set up stalls, selling everything from food and ale to weapons and armor repair services. It was a chaotic marketplace overlaid onto a battlefield. Nobles used it as a networking opportunity, arranging marriages, forging alliances, and settling disputes that didn't involve lances. The smell was a heady mix of roasting meat, stale ale, manure, and the collective body odor of a truly enormous, unwashed crowd. The sounds were deafening. The constant roar of the crowd, the blare of trumpets announcing the next bout, the shouts of hawkers, the crash of steel, the screams of horses and men. Visually, it was overwhelming. A riot of color from banners and tents, the gleam of armor, the flash of weapons, the stark, muddy field turning increasingly red as the day wore on. The touch was the constant press of the crowd, the muddy ground underfoot, the nervous sweat on your palms as you watched a particularly brutal impact. They cheered for honor while watching men get permanently crippled for prize money and bragging rights. These events reinforced the military nature of the aristocracy. You saw the knights in their expensive gear, displaying their brutal skills, reminding everyone exactly who held the power, the guys who were really, really good at hurting people. It was a performance of dominance, a demonstration that the ruling class wasn't just rich, they were also lethal. Your favorite sports star? Imagine if their game involved a 50% chance of catastrophic injury and they got paid by looting the loser. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a live-action political advertisement for the power of the guys with swords. You, with your modern sensibilities, might recoil. But remember, this was their prime-time television, their viral video feed of pain and glory. And they ate it up. Think you're above watching a train wreck. History's biggest train wrecks were often spectator events. You thought tournaments were about chivalry? Please. At their core, they were about money. Participating wasn't cheap, it was an enormous financial gamble. You needed top-tier armor costing maybe as much as a knight's annual income. You needed multiple warhorses, each potentially worth a small fortune, think the price of a luxury car, but it could literally die under you in 5 minutes. A single, well-bred warhorse could easily cost the equivalent of a peasant family's income for a decade or more. Then add the cost of squires, servants, travel, lodging, and repairs to your constantly battered gear. This wasn't a cheap hobby. It was a ruinously expensive business venture with extremely high overheads and a significant risk of physical and financial bankruptcy. Your investment strategy, hope you don't get trampled before payday, but the potential payouts were massive. The prizes themselves could be valuable horses, falcons, jewelry, sometimes even land. But the real money was in ransom. Capturing a wealthy knight could net you a small fortune. William Marshall, the ultimate tournament champion, reportedly made so much money from ransoms and prizes in his youth that he revitalized his family's fortunes. He and his partner once captured over 100 knights in a single day at one tournament. They fought for honor, but the real prize was always cold, hard cash, squeezed out of their defeated rivals. Imagine the scene in the aftermath. Not just the wounded being tended, but the victors and captives locked in tense negotiations over ransoms. The air thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and the nervous energy of men whose futures were being decided by haggling. You'd hear the clinking of coins, the rustle of parchment contracts, the strained voices arguing over figures. The touch of a victory might be the smooth, heavy feel of newly acquired coins. The touch of defeat, the rough, scratchy surface of a debt agreement you couldn't possibly pay. Your student loan debt feels bad. Try owing your entire net worth plus your horse to the guy who just knocked your lights out with a stick. Tournaments created their own economy, a whirlwind of wealth flowing between those who won big and those who lost everything. Knights could rise from relative obscurity to wealth and fame purely through success on the tournament circuit. But for every winner, there were dozens of losers, leaving the field physically broken and financially ruined, their expensive gear damaged, their horses gone, and a hefty ransom hanging over their heads. Did it pay well? Only if you were good at legally kidnapping and extorting your social equals. This wasn't a noble pursuit of glory. It was a brutal, high-stakes economic game played with human lives and limbs as collateral. And you think your job has performance pressure. You probably think that was the peak of the barbarity, right? Just wait until you hear about the times they got really creative with the ways to hurt each other. And just when you thought they might have learned their lesson, tournaments didn't just stop, they evolved. They got more formalized, more theatrical, and in some ways even more dangerous by concentrating the violence. Take the pas d'armes or passage of arms. This wasn't a big, chaotic free-for-all across the countryside anymore. It was a knight or group of knights setting up shop at a specific, often symbolic location, a bridge, a gate, a crossroads, and challenging anyone who came by to fight them. This was like a medieval boss battle come to life, a predetermined gauntlet of pain where the defender chose the terms. The defending knight often set elaborate rules, maybe specifying the type of weapon, the number of blows exchanged, or even limiting strikes to certain areas of the body. It was highly performative, staged with elaborate tents, colorful banners, and plenty of spectators watching every move. But make no mistake, the hits were still bone-jarringly real. The lances still splintered into lethal shrapnel, and the consequences were still permanently life-altering. They called it a romantic challenge, like asking someone to prom, except the refusal often involved getting hit by a poleaxe until you couldn't stand up. Then there was fighting on foot, which became a major feature, especially in later medieval and Renaissance tournaments. While jousting on horseback was the main draw, dismounted combat allowed for a different kind of brutality. Knights would face off with swords, axes, or polearms in heavy, specialized plate armor designed for this specific, grinding form of combat. Without the speed and maneuverability of a horse, these bouts became brutal, exhausting contests of sheer strength and endurance, often fought at incredibly close quarters. You were fighting toe-to-toe with someone explicitly trying to brain you with a hammer or hook your leg with a polearm weapons, specifically designed to dent metal and liquefy bone beneath it. Fighting in this heavy armor was incredibly hot and restrictive, turning every movement into a struggle. Getting knocked down while fighting on foot was often a death sentence unless your opponent was feeling particularly generous or eager for ransom. You couldn't easily get up, and your vulnerability while prone was almost total. The sound of steel ringing on steel in these close-quarters fights was deafening, a constant, high-pitched screech mixed with the grunts of agonizing effort and sharp cries of pain when something went terribly wrong. The smell was intense, trapped sweat inside the helmet, hot, stressed metal, and the distinct coppery tang of blood splattering on the ground nearby. Specific examples litter the historical record. The Pas d'Armes de la Fontaine des Pleurs in 1443, where a knight named Jean de Merode and his companions defended a spot for a year and a day, fighting challengers with various weapons according to strict, often brutal, rules. Or the Pas d'Armes de Sandricourt in 1493. These weren't minor skirmishes. They were prolonged, dangerous spectacles designed to prove a knight's mettle and attract attention, even if it meant risking life and limb in a highly controlled, yet still lethal, environment. Did adding more rules make it safer? Only if the rules included, please stop trying to cave in my chest cavity. The touch in these dismounted fights was the heavy, suffocating weight of the armor pressing down on you, the jarring vibration of impact running up your weapon into your hands and arms, the feel of the muddy or dusty ground under your heavy plate boots, every clumsy step a potential disaster. You thought jousting was bad because of the speed. Try getting into a wrestling match while wearing a refrigerator suit and someone's trying to hit your exposed joints with a metal club. These variations prove that even when they tried to formalize the violence, they just found new, creative ways to put themselves in mortal danger, all for that elusive mix of glory, cash, and the sheer, dumb thrill of being marginally less likely to die than the other guy. You're probably thinking, surely they stopped eventually, right? People must have gotten tired of all the death and dismemberment. Well, let's just say history doesn't always have the happy endings you're hoping for. You thought they'd just stop bashing each other once they figured out how many bones could break, didn't you? Nah, they just refined the process. The chaotic, wide-ranging melee gradually gave way to the more focused, televised spectacle of the joust. Why? Because it was easier to control, easier for spectators to watch, and still provided ample opportunity for high-impact violence and valuable ransoms. The joust concentrated the energy. Instead of dozens of knights hacking at each other in a muddy field, you had two guys deliberately aiming thousands of pounds of force at each other. The armor got thicker, heavier, and more specialized, particularly for jousting. Full-plate armor became the norm, often with reinforced sections on the left side and special jousting helms that offered better protection but restricted vision even further. You were basically putting yourself inside a metal can and asking someone to hit you with a telephone pole. This wasn't about agility anymore. It was about endurance and sheer, brutal impact resistance. The lances, too, became more specialized, often featuring the coronal, a blunt, multi-pronged tip designed to catch on the opponent's shield or armor and unseat them, rather than penetrate. Sounds safer, right? Wrong. The blunt force trauma was still immense. It could shatter ribs, cause massive internal bleeding, or simply knock you unconscious from the sheer shockwave. Even with blunted lances, the force of impact was estimated to be equivalent to a car crashing at moderate speed. Your seatbelt anxiety. These guys just hoped their armor didn't buckle their sternum into their spine. Tournaments became more theatrical, with elaborate processions, heraldry, and formal rules. Think less spontaneous brawl, more carefully choreographed destruction derby. Events like the famous tournament of Saint-Inglevert in 1390, where 3 French knights held a challenge against all comers for 30 days, showcased this shift towards formalized, spectacular jousting. But underneath the ceremony, the stakes remained deadly. Sir John Arundel died in a joust in 1435, crushed under his horse after being unseated. King James I of Scotland died in a tournament in 1406 after being struck in the head. They refined the rules, but they didn't eliminate the lethal potential. The smell of these later tournaments was perhaps less manure and more polished steel, sweat, and expensive perfumes from the ladies in the stands, mixed with the ever-present tang of adrenaline and danger. You'd hear the crisp crack of lances, the cheers of the crowd, the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. The touch was the slick interior of a helmet hot with sweat, the jarring recoil up your arm as your lance hit home, the cold, heavy weight of the armor a constant, suffocating presence. They made it more formal and theatrical, only succeeding in making the concentrated violence even more efficient. They tried to make it look pretty, to cloak the brutality in pageantry and rules. But the core remained the same. Rich men hitting each other with extreme force for glory, profit, and the sheer dumb thrill of survival. It wasn't just about evolving the sport. It was about finding new, exciting ways to break bones and collect ransoms while the crowd roared its approval. And you thought your hobbies were expensive and slightly dangerous. You've seen how they fought, how they got hurt, and how they made money off it. But you still haven't heard how the whole bloody business finally started to fade, sort of. You might think that with all the death, injury, and general unpleasantness, people would eventually just give up on this whole tournament thing. And you'd be partially right. Tournaments didn't vanish overnight, but they certainly changed, slowly suffocated by the march of military technology and changing aristocratic priorities. The biggest killer, gunpowder. Why bother spending a fortune training to hit someone with a stick at 30 miles an hour when a peasant with an arquebus could just shoot them from a distance? The skills honed in the lists, the charge, the lance break, the close quarters brawl in heavy armor became increasingly irrelevant on a battlefield dominated by cannons and firearms. You could be the greatest jouster who ever lived, but that didn't help much against a lead ball traveling faster than you could blink. They trained for a sport that made them perfect targets for the next generation of warfare. The cost didn't help either. Maintaining a full retinue of knights in custom-made, expensive armor designed for display and tilting was incredibly expensive and impractical for actual military campaigns. Kings and lords started investing in standing armies equipped with firearms and pike formations cheaper, more numerous, and far more effective at killing people efficiently in large battles. Your artisanal, handcrafted doom suit was no match for mass-produced lead. By the 16th century, a single well-aimed cannonball could dismantle an entire formation of knights in expensive plate armor. Your personalized, high-end gear, instantly obsolete thanks to a cheap metal tube and some powder. Tournaments lingered, especially the joust, transforming further into pure spectacle, grand theatrical displays for coronations and royal weddings, rather than serious tests of martial skill or opportunities for mass ransom. Think Renaissance fair jousting, but with slightly higher stakes and less convincing accents. The danger was still there, as King Henry II of France's fatal accident in 1559 grimly proved, but the purpose shifted. It was less about proving you were a valuable warrior, and more about showing off how much money you could spend on looking impressive while trying not to die publicly. The smell changed too. Less sweat and blood, maybe more perfume and expensive fabrics from the increasingly courtly crowds, but eventually mixed with the sharp, acrid odor of gunpowder from the battlefield. The sound of shattering lances and clanging steel was eventually drowned out by the roar of cannons and the crackle of musket fire. The touch shifted from rough leather and cold steel to the smooth wood of a firearm stock, the heavy weight of a powder bag. Did chivalry kill the tournament? No, a cheaper, more efficient way to kill people did. Tournaments in their brutal, high-stakes form became relics of a bygone era, replaced by a colder, more impersonal form of warfare. The knight, encased in his expensive, vulnerable armor, gave way to the soldier, less glamorous but far more effective at dispensing death at a distance. You thought the tournament was the peak of medieval violence. History just found a more industrial way to deliver it. You might think this is where the story ends, a nice, neat conclusion about progress. But history rarely gives you that kind of comfort. And so, the real, brutal tournament of broken bones and stolen horses mostly died out, replaced by cannons and muskets. But the idea of the tournament, the romanticized version, that stuck around like a particularly nasty venereal disease. Even as actual knights faded into history, people started looking back with rose-tinted glasses, remembering the pageantry and the honor, and conveniently forgetting all the disembowelment and financial ruin. This is where the myth of chivalry really took hold, long after the reality had packed up its tents and ransom lists. The 19th century, bless its romantically misguided heart, saw a revival of interest in tournaments, attempts to recreate the glory without all the death. The Eglinton Tournament of 1839 in Scotland is a perfect example. A massive, expensive failure plagued by terrible weather, organizational disasters, and participants who, bless their cotton socks, weren't actually trained medieval warriors. One jouster reportedly used an umbrella to protect himself from the rain during the joust. It was less brutal medieval reality and more a soggy, awkward cosplay convention with slightly heavier props. They tried to revive the age of chivalry and ended up proving why modernity, despite its flaws, is perhaps marginally better than getting rained on in a field while wearing a tin can. But the myth persists. You still see the image of the noble knight, the shining armor, the pure test of skill, divorced from the context of it being a hyper-violent, high-stakes business venture designed to inflict pain and acquire property. The smell of that Eglinton attempt was probably wet wool, soggy sandwiches, and profound embarrassment, a far cry from the sweat and blood of the real thing. You'd hear polite applause instead of terrified screams, see umbrellas instead of splintering lances. The touch was probably cold, damp metal and soggy turf, a pathetic imitation of the vibrant, horrifying sensory overload of a real medieval tournament. Thinking the Eglinton tournament captured the medieval reality is like thinking your fantasy football league is actual warfare. Even today, we cling to that image of the knight, the warrior who fought for something pure, ignoring the fact that the historical knight was often a brutal mercenary in fancy clothes, using tournaments to practice his deadly skills and get rich off his social circle. The legacy isn't just the formal sport that evolved into things like modern equestrian events. It's the enduring lie that violence for profit and status can be inherently noble or honorable. Did the tournaments leave us a legacy of noble ideals? Mostly just a persistent belief that looking good in armor makes you a good person, despite the mountain of evidence to the contrary. They managed to rebrand state-sanctioned brutality as romantic aspiration. And you, with your fascination with knights and castles, fell for it hook, line, and splintered lance. So you survived the script, felt enlightened. Or just slightly disgusted and possibly questioning your life choices. Good, that was the point. You thought this was just a history lesson about some old-timey sport. You were wrong. This is a lesson about how easily we romanticize brutality, how we turn blood and pain into spectacle, and how the pursuit of status and wealth through high-stakes, dangerous displays is as old as guys hitting each other with sticks for money. The medieval tournament wasn't an anomaly. It was a raw, unfiltered look at human nature, our love for spectacle, our tolerance for suffering, and our endless capacity to invent elaborate, dangerous ways to climb the social ladder. You still see it today. The gladiatorial arenas might be different, the armor replaced by sponsorships and protective gear. But the core impulse to watch people risk it all for fame and fortune hasn't changed one bit. So next time you see some polished, romantic image of a knight or a seemingly noble competition, remember the mud, the blood, the screams, and the calculating demands for ransom. Remember that history isn't a fairy tale. It's a warning, and you were just a tourist in its most brutal theme park.